everybody. We're going to get started. I want to start off this webinar by thanking each of you for being with us today. Your time and attention are very important, and we appreciate you spending it with Darcy for an hour. We're covering an incredibly relevant topic today. How can we safely and effectively return to in-person trade shows and events? You know, as event planners and trade show planners, we understand this can be kind of overwhelming, and it's not something we're really used to. But, you know, that's why we invited you all here today, because we've put together an internal task force who's responsible for gathering all the pertinent details about the top trade shows and conventions. So that said, I'd like to introduce part of that task force. I am Allie Hughes. I am the marketing manager here at Darcy, and I'm joined by Jan Grunewald. He's our Director of International Services and is also our task force leader. Today, he's going to be covering the topic of safety and well-being. We're also joined by Todd Sussman, who's our VP of Creative, and he's going to be discussing various considerations for exhibit design. And then Pete Riddell, he's our Executive Creative Director of Customer Experience and Storytelling. He's going to be covering the topics of audience engagement and effectively engaging with them. So before we get started, a few quick logistics. You are all on mute, so we don't have any background noise. But we do want to communicate with you. So throughout the presentation, if you have any questions, feel free to submit those through the question function. We've reserved a little bit of time at the end, and we'll be answering as many questions as we can. But if we don't get to your question, we will follow up with you individually so you can get that answered. We want to also thank you for submitting your answer to our registration question about what is your biggest concern as you make the return. We've done our best to incorporate a lot of your answers throughout the presentation. And lastly, no worries if you need to jump off at any point. We are recording the webinar and we'll be sending it in the coming days. And then before I hand it off to Jan, who's our first speaker, I want to reiterate that regulations and suggestions are changing every day. With the CDC's recent announcement of masks not being required for vaccinated adults indoors or outdoors, we saw that news trickle down into the trade show and event protocols within days. We're now tracking about 100 shows, and 20 of them made adjustments to their protocols in a few days. And we'll be talking about some of those. Also worth noting that the insights we gathered are just the sampling associations. Like I said, we're tracking about 100 shows, and our considerations are purely that. We want to arm you with the guidelines and the topics that are most important to pay attention to and keep top of mind. At the end of the day, what you implement for your shows is going to be on a case-by-case basis that takes into consideration the local regulations, protocols, and ensuring the comfort of your staffers and then your audience, of course. But with that said, I would love to pass it off to Jan to talk about safety and well-being.
Well, thank you, Allie. So we're going to start off with safety and well-being. And you know, based on your answers to our question about what you are most concerned about as you make your return to in-person events, many of you indicated that was how to proactively prepare for our shows while staying up to date and mindful of evolving safety protocols. We consider these to be the top 5 topics you will need to track and be considerate of as you prepare for the return of in-person trade shows. For each of these topics, we will provide insight into what we currently know and some examples of these regulations carried out in the events that already have taken place, as well as what upcoming trade shows are planning to do. Vaccinations. At this time, generally not required by show organizers, but is under consideration, at least for some shows. At this time, the most prominent show that we are aware of that has added a vaccination requirement is Hughes, to be held in August in Las Vegas. The requirement was added the Monday following the CDC announcement that fully vaccinated people could forego mask wearing in most situations. A person is considered fully vaccinated 2 weeks after their second dose or 2 weeks after their only dose with the Johnson & Johnson vaccines. Hughes is currently working on an accessible and private validating solution to verify this vaccination requirement. Last March, the NAPA 401k Summit planned for September in Las Vegas was still considering proof of vaccination or a negative COVID test. and even considering on-site rapid testing. Those requirements were dropped last week as well as the language pertaining to daily temperature checks. The CHESS show this October in Orlando is asking attendees and staff to attest to receiving a vaccination, but has not gone beyond that and is not currently planning to ask for proof of vaccination. Testing and screening. At this time, most organizers still plan on temperature checks and a basic health screening as a requirement for entrance onto the show floor. We have not seen any shows that have made on-site rapid testing a requirement for entry. World of Concrete, upcoming in early June in Las Vegas, is a major domestic trade show, normally attracting more than 50,000 attendees and is being watched by many industry insiders as a leading indicator of how other shows may choose to proceed, particularly in Las Vegas as they approach 100% capacity. World of Concrete will be screening all guests for elevated temperature prior to entry. They have reduced social distancing to 3 feet, and they have extra wide aisles and will recommend mask wearing but not mandated. AACC in September in Atlanta will be sending all attendees a daily text health screening questionnaire, in addition to requiring temperature checks upon entry. We are seeing different shows taking different approaches. Mask mandates. The vast majority of shows is still requiring masks, but we are starting to see some organizers assessing whether or not this still will be required. For ASRA, on May 13th in Orlando, masks were still required. The Precast show on May 20th in New Orleans dropped their mask mandate the day before the show opened, and this illustrates the rapid shift in protocols that is currently taking place. ASRA and Precast were only 1 week apart, but are separated by the CDC announcement relaxing mask wearing recommendations. The Napa 401k Summit allows vaccinated attendees to go maskless, while the NAB show in October in Las Vegas, as of now, is still requiring masks for all attendees and staffers. We do expect many organizers to adjust their policy as mask mandates across the country are being lifted. Social distancing is still generally recommended by the show organizers, but we are starting to see shows that are removing the language pertaining this from their protocols, and some that are reducing the required distance from 6 to 3 feet. Many organizers also recommend that social distancing is kept in mind when laying out the actual booth space and are widening their aisles. FabTech, for example, in September in Chicago, will have signage and floor decals in all common areas to encourage social distancing. PAC Expo in September in Las Vegas, on the other hand, removed all social distancing language from the protocols. The NAB show in October in Las Vegas, however, still plans to implement, and the manual actually states enforce, a 6-foot social distancing requirement for queue lines, etc. Also, capacity limits will be implemented in certain areas. Cleaning procedures. In collaboration with the convention centers, virtually all show organizers have instituted more frequent and enhanced cleaning of all common areas, as well as the exhibit halls. Also, hand sanitizing stations will be made available at virtually all shows in common area and in the show floor aisles. As in the past, the exhibitor will remain responsible for cleaning their own booth. Many general contractors are now offering disinfecting services in addition to standard cleaning for exhibitors to order, as well as a line of safety products like hand sanitizing stations and plexiglass barriers. While the science is starting to reassess the risk of COVID-level transmissions from hard surfaces like countertops, there's a lot to be said for reassuring guests and making them feel comfortable in your space. And these examples that we are listing could have been from just about any of the more than 100 shows we are tracking. At ASRA earlier this month, we saw exhibitors frequently wipe down all high-touch areas. Hughes is advertising they will use EPA-approved cleaning solutions to disinfect the venue and the show hall. FabTech touts the GBAC Star accreditation of the McCormick Place Convention Center in their cleaning protocols. This is an accreditation that many convention centers have applied for since the start of COVID. GBAC stands for Global Biorisk Advisory Council, and they train and then evaluate the facility on their ability to establish and maintain proper cleaning protocols, and that they have knowledgeable staff with regards to minimizing the risk of spreading infectious diseases like COVID. Since I oversee Dersi's international department, there had to be an international slide. For the international events we have been monitoring in Europe, we are seeing many more requirements in place than for shows in the US. Besides standard social distancing requirements for European shows, we are often seeing that exhibitors are required to post and enforce booth capacity limits. Many shows require the exhibitor to appoint a safety monitor, and they must submit a health and safety plan outlining all steps taken to mitigate the spread of COVID. Several shows require visitor logs from exhibitors for possible contact tracing, and we have seen organizing require movement tracing via a mandatory smartphone app for the show. While in the US, setback rules and plexiglass barriers are framed as a recommendation, in Europe they are requirements. Mobile World Congress in June in Barcelona has established formulas to calculate the maximum occupancy of the exhibit. Mobile World Congress has specific rules on in-booth and closed conference rooms that go as far as specifying where air conditioners can vent out and what type of filter must be used. EUHA in September in Hanover, Germany also sets capacity limits based upon booth size and requires exhibitors to keep a log of anyone spending more than 15 minutes in the booth for possible contact tracing. Well, with all that being said, I will hand over the controls to Todd.
All right, thanks, Jan. No, I appreciate that. So now we want to go ahead and dive into the exhibit design portion of the webinar. And from there, we wanted to be able to start out with, just some of the things that we're hearing, from clients and prospects. And really, one of the main things that stood out was, how will my booth design and layout need to evolve to adhere to protocols, the protocols that Jan was just outlining, as well as to make attendees feel safe. So in this next section, we're going to give you just some of our thoughts on how you can begin to successfully plan your next event. But before we dive into some of the physical structure and layout of your environment, we wanted to give you just some general insights and considerations, which are really based on some of the effects of physical distancing and capacity limitations, again, that Jan was reiterating in the earlier segment, at your events. So some of these considerations are, separation of exhibit components to allow for natural physical distancing, right? So not necessarily designing a space that feels more crowded. Let's spread some of those components out. Again, comfort is king for your attendees as well as your staff. If lower attendance is expected, think about sending less staff. I think that there's a tendency for everyone to want to go to trade shows, and rightly so. But if you're expecting lower attendance, meet those clients where they are by sending less staff. Although one of the things I will say is, from some of the shows that we've been recently sending clients to, we've heard some really great feedback on higher than expected attendance levels, and that their wants and needs at the show were being met in terms of connections. And then think about pre-scheduling meetings in order to limit capacity. A lot of you probably try and do this anyway, but the reason why you go to shows is to be able to get people engaged in the booth space from a foot traffic perspective, but try and mix in as many pre-scheduled meetings as possible to limit overall capacity in your booth space. And bring only the most relevant product lines, right? This is something that is a constant struggle between sales and marketing. Sales wanting to bring every product that the company has, marketing wanting to limit that. Think about, in this particular case, only the most relevant product lines, something that is new or something that has, an innovation tag to it. And then when we're laying out the actual booth space, anticipate where some of those high traffic volumes are going to be, and plan accordingly using some purposeful pathways throughout the space. So again, really think about that space planning, and we'll give you a few insights on that as well. And then utilize technology within the overall space. So things like beacons and RFID can really aid in how we look at crowd density within your overall space. It's really difficult to monitor, as a human, but let's go ahead and use technology to try and mitigate some of that crowd density as well. So before we go ahead and talk about the future in your space planning, we wanted to look at some of shows that were in the recent past, right? And these are shows that actually took place earlier this month, and some at the end of April. And while these are driven mainly, these points that we're gonna go over are driven mainly by the associations, I think that it's helpful to be able to gain some insight into what we're going to see in the near future. So for MRO Americas that you see that was at the end of April in Orlando, they decided that they weren't going to have aisle carpet. So again, people may have shown up to the show and saw that that was unexpected, wanted to put that out there. That's something that you may see in the near future. Extending aisles with tables and chairs, again, trying to spread things out, in the convention centers, in the show halls, just by going ahead and utilizing, different aisle carpets, spreading things out with furniture, potentially considering dedicated entrance and exit points with one-way traffic flows. So not only as we enter the convention center, but also as we enter the show halls, and then as we navigate those show halls, there'll probably be some signage that tries to keep people on a one-way traffic flow. And then, as we've seen at the ASRA show, and Jan had mentioned some of the high points of this show earlier, no food and beverage was allowed on the show floor. So that could be a common theme that we're starting to see in at least the near future moving forward. So now that we've talked about the macro at the association level, let's talk a little bit about the exhibit design itself and how we lay out your booth space. And really, there's two main schools of thought, an open floor plan and a closed floor plan. So first, the open floor plan, where attendees can feel free to engage in the space as they see fit based on their comfort level. There's ample room between physical structures, and it's a general open feeling, right? So it's more of a grazing type method where you can come in and out as you please. And then there's the closed method. We're seeing this a lot in Europe as well. Where you're literally controlling the entrance and exit points, right? So you might check in at a reception counter, and we're trying to create and craft that customer journey to be more of like a one-way traffic flow before you get into meetings and then exit out of the booth space. And one of the things that we really wanted to try and do was put together a more of an illustration, a rendering, which really highlights some of the points of that closed environment, because it's really hard to really visualize what that looks like. The open floor plan is a little bit more of what we're used to. The closed floor plan can really be still, an elegant space. You don't necessarily have to have, barriers that are all 8 foot tall. You can have some that are lower, but really what they do is they control the egress into the space. So again, a dedicated entrance and exit in and out of the space, usually through a reception counter. There'll be signage that'll be on the inside, of the booth spaces to be able to navigate the attendees or help them navigate in a one-way flow throughout the space, where then they can engage with the product areas and some of the semi-private meeting areas. And we'll talk a little bit more about meeting areas later on in this section. But as we start to look at the overall booth space, we wanted to talk more about individual components and how we can design some of those to meet your needs at the particular show. And we start out with reception counters, right? And typically that's the first thing that people will engage with. And to bring this back to what Jan had mentioned earlier in his portion was, we're starting to see some of the acrylics and whatnot in terms of shielding start to go away here in the States, but they're still mandated for the most part for international shows. So again, think about some of these acrylic barriers, not only for your shows in the States, depending upon how your staff feels, how the attendees feel at that show, but definitely look at that from an international standpoint. And then theater areas, right? So we know that we still want to have presentations within the overall space. So what could that potentially look like? So, encourage the audience to maintain their distance with appropriately spaced out seating, right? So whether we use individual chairs or we use ottomans, and again, this is ever changing, right? Right now in this rendering, we're depicting 6 foot in between each one of them. Some of these have already relaxed to 3 foot, and we might see further relaxation as we move forward within the year. If you're standing for a presentation, think about utilizing flooring inlays, right? So in the absence of seating, let attendees know where it's safe to stand by marking things on the floor. And then from a presentation perspective, the presenters are used to roaming around on a stage. Maybe put them in a stationary position behind a podium per se, with a plexiglass barrier. Again, just recommendations on how people are feeling. As we go into the demo stations where we're really going to be interacting with products and staff, consider back-to-back stations that really serve as more of a natural barrier, right? We've got that wall panel in between with back-to-back stations, but really what this can aid in is spacing out your overall footprint, right? It actually saves space. It allows us to create a little bit more space from a physical distancing standpoint, and giving the attendees a more of a comfort feeling overall. Again, comfort is king. Incorporate technology into the space. Some of the innovations that we've seen recently that were launched at the online version of CES earlier this year were keyboards that were bathed in UV light to be able to kill viruses. So that technology is ever evolving. Utilizing stylus with touchscreens, and Pete in his engagement section coming up in just a minute is going to talk a little bit more about touchscreens. But if we want to go ahead and actually engage with the touchscreens rather than using individuals' hands, think about using a recyclable or cleanable stylus. And then consider acrylic dividers to separate staff and attendees. And as we break down further into a booth space, we know that we want to have meetings with our clients, right? So meeting areas are really important. And we'll talk a little bit about conference rooms in a minute, but maybe utilize some open air meeting spaces, and utilizing individual club chairs or ottomans, rather than couches and love seats. While I think that we're all really anxious to be able to meet up again, it's all about the comfort of your attendees, right? So people may not necessarily be ready to sit shoulder to shoulder anymore. So avoid couches and love seats. Think about using larger diameter tables where possible. And again, more in Europe than in the States, still consider those acrylic dividers in meeting spaces. And then obviously, leave time in between scheduled meetings to properly clean and sanitize the areas, right? Utilizing those reassurance protocols that Jan talked about in his section, as well. So again, making people feel comfortable by overtly cleaning in between sessions. And then finally, we want to talk about conference rooms, right? We all want to be able to meet with our clients in an enclosed space. We might want to think about allocating more space to accommodate physical distancing, right? Typically, it's how many people can we pack into a conference room? We might want to think about fewer chairs that are spaced out accordingly. Naturally keeping occupancy levels down. Consider removing the ceiling. Sometimes we do that for sound. Maybe for the short term, consider removing the ceiling to increase airflow. And then use technology, in the conference room, such as air scrubbing or purification. There's been a number of different products that have been launched since the beginning of the year, even into last year, that help scrub the air. And then, if possible, take meetings off-site or even outside, right? So depending upon, when your show is and what location it's in, consider off-site meetings or outside meetings. And for the next section, I'd love to be able to pass it over to Pete to talk about audience engagement.
Thanks, Todd. So on top of everything that Jan broached and everything that Todd broached, at the end of the day, if you're showing up to ideally, meaningfully, mutually meaningfully engage with your audience, right? So we wanted to, first of all, thank all of those who shared their concerns and curiosities in advance that touched on some of these things. And and your input inspired the breadcrumbs that we'll be sharing today on audience engagement. But among the things that came up, I think this was Tim at Expedia, and this kind of tees it up perfectly. So yes, safety, yes, honoring all the requirements, but at the end of the day, what is it going to take for us to effectively, which connotes impact, and safely engage with clients and prospects? And are there going to be additional resources required for that? I mean, big considerations. Lots of curiosities around touchless technology. This is probably the single most important ingredient with regards to a successful engagement moving forward. It's making sure your staff is equipped and prepared to successfully engage your audiences. It's been a minute since they've been out into the world doing this, right? So do not discount and really double down on equipping and preparing your staff for what they can potentially expect. This is a great point. Finding the right balance between putting the effort into returning to in-person, and then also keeping in mind that there may be virtual access as well. And we'll be touching on that. We have perhaps a cautionary tale to share on that. And then the idea of, okay, is it going to take more for us to do both, to do a hybrid approach, to successfully activate on site and then also cater to those audiences that may be online or in person? So again, what is it going to take? Are we going to have to invest more? I mean, again, these are really good questions. So before we kind of dive into that pool, I do want to just gently remind us all that now and really probably through the end of the year, we are still going to be in liminal space, in that messy middle, the hell in the hallway. The space between no longer and not yet. So as we all carry forward, we're going to be dealing with imperfect circumstances, and we have to allow for the fact that we may deal with those imperfectly, and that's okay. I have faith, just based on the curiosity and the concerns that everyone is on this call is wrestling with, that we are going to make the most of this, and that what I always tell my team on the cusp of doing something challenging is the good news is we're going to be a heck of a lot wiser on the other side of this, right? So we're going to learn an awful lot together with and from each other moving forward. So again, just be kind to yourselves and your team as we navigate all of these. So diving in, question came in: should we eliminate touchscreens from our in-booth engagement? So our encouragement to our clients when this subject is broached is to kind of zoom out a little bit and frame it around where and how are there areas of opportunity to reduce friction from the attendee experience, right? That's a broader perspective, But what this is aiming at is how can we make the experience better for the user, right? And touchscreens may be a part of that for some of you, right? So, but when we talk about frictionless engagement, here's some things to think about. I think we've all learned as consumers over the past year plus is that there's a lot to be said for leveraging and enabling users to use the device that they trust most, the one they keep in their pocket, for engagement. So certainly a lot of us have subsisted and benefited from, you know, the classic QR code as a frictionless way to access and view content. Again, easy peasy, puts no barriers between your audience and accessing content. But there's a lot more to think about. Are there opportunities to allow your staff, whether they have their own tablets or devices, to take over screens in your space, whether that's for one-on-one presentations or one-to-small group presentations, to do that in a nimble and flexible way? There's also approaches that allow your attendees to be able to take over screens and to actually drive from their device. So Free Touch is one that was lauded by Fast Company in 2021. There are others out there as well, but you can let your audiences drive as well. And you can also think about up-leveling experience and content. So, you know, not just accessing and viewing content, but allowing richer content experiences, whether it's through gamification, whether it's through education, you know, Q&A trivia based. We're going to talk a little bit later about some opportunities with augmented reality. But again, a lot of these things are also reliant on web-based experiences. And the beauty of web-based experiences, getting back to one of the concerns or curiosities that was expressed by one of our registrants, is a good web experience can be leveraged not only in person, but also can be leveraged obviously online virtually as well. So if you're choosing to invest, you can really maximize the potential value of that as well. Again, we'll talk about augmented reality in some detail in a minute, but there's other opportunities. Again, when you're thinking about how can we remove friction, depending on the content, you can use floor triggers. You can also use gesture-based engagements as well. We do have a cautionary tale with regards to gesture. There's a lot of great technology out there for gesture. I think as it relates to conferences and events, which are definitely short attention span theater, you want to keep things really, really, really simple. So if gesture allows for kind of easy access to content, I think it could be useful. But if there is any sort of learning curve to successfully using a gesture-based interaction, like do they have to figure out the depth? Do they have to figure out how they're controlling? That's probably adding friction rather than removing. So again, we just say be judicious in where and how you think about gesture. Great question. This kind of broaches the hybrid conundrum. Should our virtual engagement strategy differ from our in-person strategy? And again, the lens that we encourage for our clients on this topic is meet your audiences where they are. If you believe that there will be a high concentration of your target audiences that will still yet be engaging online or virtually, then that's definitely something to think about. If anyone on the webinar has sat in on previous webinars of ours or engaged with us offline or maybe snacked on some of our thought leadership content, you've probably heard us speak about our concept, our vision of the infinity loop. And the idea behind this is it's kind of a meet them where they are approach, a programmatic approach to both successfully activating and connecting with your at-home or virtual audiences, and then also planning for the safe return. The approach here is predicated on one thing. Think about it as one conversation that you're hosting with your customers that's merely taking place in different places, in different spaces, at different moments. But think of it all as links in a larger chain, right? So as you think about your virtual and your online, how does that connect with, how does that integrate with your in-person? Similarly, how does your in-person experience, how can you leverage your online assets to kind of extend that interaction as well? One of the things that I'll say, most optimistic about coming out of all this is my belief and my hope is that events and conferences and trade shows are going to be seen as a more integrated piece of the marketing mix, right? I think that there will be a greater validation of the value and as a meaningful part of the larger playbook, right? So this infinity loop is predicated on that. So meeting your audience is what they are. What does that mean specific to your virtual and online audience? It's really a question of how can you best serve your virtual or your online audience, right? And again, this ties back to, again, one of the good concerns that was raised in advance of the webinar, and that was finding the right balance between putting the effort into the in-person event versus anticipated virtual access. So I'm going to share an anecdote here, and it's kind of an extreme example, but I think it might serve as a parable for this topic. I was talking with Angela, a colleague of mine, a couple weeks ago, and she had just recently helped support a client who was exhibiting at an educational conference in Hawaii. So I'll just give you a moment to kind of eye roll at educational conference in Hawaii. But the organizers, they had the in-person experience, but then they also streamed a lot of content for obviously those who were not able to attend. What they found was they had great on-site registration, but in the actual execution of the seminar and the seminars and the sessions, they had very low attendance because the attendees realized I can actually hang out on the beach with my Mai Tai and snack on the session content and the educational content. And I think the parable there, the lesson is that attendees are a lot like children in the sense that if you give them an easier way to do something, they're probably going to do it, right? But it also gives us a lens to think about for our educational conferences that are not in Hawaii. How can you create demand for your in-person and still yet satisfy those audiences that may be engaging remotely or online? And one of the approaches might be to stagger some of the dissemination of that content so you can create and preserve exclusivity for the in-person and still dole out as appropriate online content, but not in a way that cannibalizes the engagement you're seeking on site. So I really think it's a question about when you think about your online audiences, how can you give them access to valuable things? And valuable is defined by them, by your audiences. It's not defined by you. What would your audiences find value in? How can you deliver what they need, right? And they may not even be aware of what they need that you are actually able to deliver. So, think about that. So when we say valuable, it might also be exclusive because you're vying for attention and eyeballs, right? So how can you encourage that? So for those of you who are with companies for whom this kind of thing applies, you can still do the act now, like show specials in and around the conference. Make that available on a time-limited basis to your online audience to encourage their engagement. You can think about streamed content, but again, you might want to think carefully about like live streaming versus on demand. One of the other things that I know I'm particularly excited about on the other side of this is I think we've all learned that there should be great promise in your in-person experience as an opportunity to generate content, to create content. So when you think about your return to in-person, especially if you're thinking that, hey, the attendance may not be great for some, right? If you're activating at a conference or an event here in the very near term, well, how can you generate content with your presence that then can be leveraged in other channels after the fact? So again, you're kind of maximizing your presence to generate meaningful content because quite often you are going to have your thought leaders, your subject matter experts at your live event, right? So think about your live event as a content generation opportunity. And then the last thing is think about like what would be a novel experience that could serve our online audience or online and in person, right? And I think all of us, and again, again, bless the hearts of the 190 some people who are still attending webinars at this point in time. But think about the novel experience, right? You know, I had a colleague who described kind of like our experiences collectively with webinars as, you know, like eating a day-old cheeseburger, right? Like we'll eat it, but we're probably only gonna eat so much of it, and we're probably gonna eat it only so often. So again, attendees' appetites for consuming online content, obviously not what it was maybe a year plus. So think about how can you deliver things of value, right? So when you think about audience engagement, we talked about augmented reality. I think there's a great place for augmented reality, you know, in engagement, but in particular, what we're really, really excited about is the idea of using augmented reality as a portal into another world. So the example that we're showing on screen is some great work by some friends of ours at AirCards. Hat tip to Lewis and the team at AirCards. But what you can see, it's a consumer activation, and the tent kind of appears out of nowhere, right, when you engage. And this is kind of like opening up the world of Yosemite, and it's a co-promotion with Mick Ultra. But again, like the symbolism of this, I think is really intriguing, right? So when you think about your in-person experience, how can you give audiences access to other worlds? I mean, it might be a product theater that you're hosting at a conference that you want to make available and virtualize to your audience, but allowing your audiences to kind of like step into and experience that world. Maybe you have a, you know, a new state-of-the-art manufacturing facility that you want to open up to audiences as well. Again, there's some magic to this, and there's an opportunity to allow folks into your unique space or spaces. Conversely, this could also serve your in-person experience. Let's just say you're showing up in a 10 by 10. Well, you could leverage something like this to provide a portal into a much larger world that is not confined to your 10 by 10. So again, back to the idea of maximizing efficiency and value of digital experiences. You can invest in creating things that can serve not just your in-person, but also your online. So wrapping up the engagement chapter here, again, our encouragement is simply to meet your audiences where they are, and not just physically, whether they're at home or in person, but also educationally, intellectually, emotionally as well. And you know, and meet them where they are and deliver the things that you're uniquely able to provide that they need or may not even be aware of that they need. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Allie, who will bring us home, and we'll open it up to questions here in a minute.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Jan, Todd, and Pete. This is all incredible insights, and I think it's going to be really valuable content for our audience on the webinar today. One thing that I just wanted to reiterate that I mentioned earlier in the call is we're all going to be able to be here to help you plan. However, it's going to be so important to continuously look at the local governance, you know, the show organizer and the protocols that they're putting out there, because as we saw with the CDC's announcement, protocols are changing on a daily basis. So it'll be so important to continuously monitor what your show is publishing from a requirement standpoint. And then comfort is king. It has to do with how you're going to feel comfortable engaging with your audience and the comfort level of your staffers. So at the end of the day, we're going to meet you where you are, and we can help you plan appropriately for trade shows, which have been long awaited. So I will start with some questions here. We had a variety of them, but we have a little bit of time. So let me pull one of those up. I'm going to tee this one up to Jan, and it's about the cleaning protocols. Are vendors typically responsible for wiping down surfaces of their own booth? Is this a buyable service, or are shows now offering it as a part of their space rental? Can you talk us through a little bit of what you've been seeing in all of your research among this varying different shows?
So yes, organizers are requiring, like their third-party suppliers to implement the same, strict cleaning and disinfecting standards that they adhere to make their exhibitors feel safe. Like the on-site logistics company, the FedEx, they're all being held to the same standards. Food service has been, reconstructed to meet much stricter, health and safety guidelines. With that being said, like the exhibitor will still remain responsible for cleaning and disinfecting their own booth, just like it has been in the past.
No, that's helpful. Thank you. Next question is kind of, I'm going to tee this up to Todd because this is something that you covered in your section, but then Jan, if you have anything else you wanted to add in. Todd, when you were talking about the general show floor observations, you mentioned briefly that food and beverage are not going to be allowed on the show floor. And I'm pretty sure that's one observation we made from one show, but I know that we have a lot of clients that rely on sampling food in their booth as well as catering. So can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure, and again, it really depends on, as you mentioned, what the show is, where the show is, what that governance is. But yeah, for instance, I mean, we obviously, as you mentioned, have clients that are in the food service industry, and sampling is a big part of that. So those still will be allowed at the shows, and we're looking at what that specific guidance is. But I can probably defer to Jan for some of the specifics, because I know that, you know, for shows like NACS and sweets and snacks and whatnot, there's different regulations that go with those particular shows. But yeah, it's not a one size fits all. We were giving just a representation of some of the things that we've seen at a particular show.
Yeah, and you know, Todd, NAFM, and that's one I looked at particularly, and I remember because they are not implementing any additional restrictions, you know, compared to prior years as far as food preparation and distribution in their event coming up in August in Orlando. Other events, and I believe Pizza Expo is one of those, they are not permitting at this time to have the traditional food preparation in the booth. There's a lot of convention centers that will not allow any food distribution that has not been ordered through the convention center. So, and then also there, in between there are shows that only permit individually wrapped items to be distributed. So no communal sharing, only individual prepackaged food items can be distributed.
Thank you both for the insight there. One of the next questions that we got is a little bit more insight into the pros and cons about a show organizer, you know, choosing to have carpet and not having carpet. You know, what are the reasons behind that? Do we have any insight there?
I think you know, anecdotally, the things that I've heard are, and again, as we learn more and more about, you know, the virus itself, that there were thoughts about, you know, carpet as flooring not necessarily being as hygienic, you know, from that standpoint, and I think it was left out at MRO Americas just for the simple fact that it would be, you know, cleaner to be able to have, you know, at that particular show, right? So, but we've also seen other shows that have taken place that do have aisle carpet. So again, it's a one size fits one, not a one size fits all. But I believe that it had more to do with the perception of health and safety in terms of it being hygienic versus not.
Mm-hmm. I will. We'll do two more questions here, and then we'll give everybody a little bit time back in their day. But one of these I think is going to be really relevant, because everything that we've been saying is comfort is king. And if you want to enforce certain things to make your staffers and attendees feel comfortable, I think this is going to be a really relevant question for you. So if a show isn't requiring a mask, will I have the option to require a mask for an attendee to enter into my respective booth? Someone want to take that one? Jan, Todd?
Yeah, and just like we see, you know, on a local level, while the restrictions may be lifted, there are still certain establishments that require a mask for you to be allowed to enter. And I believe that, you know, an exhibitor will have in general the right to ask attendees to wear a mask. Of course, you get a little bit into, a touchy situation. There are people that will wear a mask regardless and people that are opposed to it. So it could lead to some controversy on the show floor.
No, that makes sense. And we just got another question here. Can you speak about what you are seeing as far as audience numbers? And I know that that's something that's very relevant and a concern for a lot of our attendees. I wonder how businesses will prioritize sending staff to attend trade shows rather than other business priorities like visiting customers directly. It'd be really great to hear what kind of insight we have there regarding attendance.
I guess I'll start out. Some of the feedback that we're starting to get from our account teams that are actually taking clients, to particular shows, and I had outlined some of those, and there's more and more every day where we're gathering feedback, is that I think the exhibitors were prepping for lower attendance numbers, and they were happy to be able to see that people were ready to get out and meet again face to face, not only with the attendance numbers, but really even more so with the quality of the interactions. So it wasn't just, wow, the show was really well attended. It was, what did that particular exhibitor come away with? Did their goals get met at that particular show? And what we're hearing back from some of our clients that have exhibited already is that the answer is yes. So it's the quality of those interactions. Yes, it may be a little bit more selective in who gets sent rather than sending the masses. But the quality of the interactions that we've seen thus far have been really, really high quality, and the goals set out by our clients have for the most part been met along the way. So I'm not sure if Pete or Jan have further insights into that.
The only thing I would weigh in, and this is not based on empirical evidence, but this is based on kind of like an opportunity to help your teams kind of like figure that out, right? There could be an opportunity for you to proactively let your customers know, hey, we are going to be in attendance at this show. We are preparing to deliver not just a safe, but a really impactful experience, lots of areas of opportunity to meet on and off the show floor. So you can use it to lean into a more higher touch outreach to your audiences, and then that'll give you maybe more of a pulse of who's planning to go, who's not planning to go, and then so you can meet those audiences where they are as well. So again, I think associations probably are going to be some better than others in kind of proactively giving you pulses on this is the attendance, the reg to date kind of thing to help you plan accordingly. But it is an opportunity for you to double down to kind of like just check in with your most important customers and get a sense of like what they're seeing as a variable to help you influence how to right size the staff that you take as well, for what that's worth.
Thank you, guys. One really quick last question that I think will be a very easy one to cover, but we've had a few people ask. We said that early on we were tracking about 100 trade shows now, and someone's just wondering what is the extent of all the industries we're tracking. I can just list out some are from the pharmaceutical side, medical device, food and food service, as well as manufacturing, energy. Jan, you can probably list them all off. You know them so well at this point.
Yeah, it's really, the whole spectrum. And of course, we focused on those shows that traditionally the Jersey clients are attending. And then, obviously, a couple international shows, as we have clients that, exhibit in Europe.
Yep, definitely. I would say it's got to be close to like 25 different industries that we're tracking, but okay. And then anyone else that we didn't get to your questions, we will be following up with you individually. And just a reminder that, because there are so many trade shows, of course, and it's so important just to continuously track the changes that are evolving with the show regulations. and that you're being up to date with the latest protocols. I thank you for joining us today. We will be sending the webinar recording in the next couple of days. And then, like I said, any questions we didn't answer, we will follow up with you individually. And if things come to mind in the coming days, always feel free to email info@durfee.com, and we'll make sure we can get that answered for you. All right. I hope you guys all have a good rest of your day. Thank you.